Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. Bob is out today, but will be rejoining us soon. But today, we are doing our part 2 on digging into the future protest post-Cop City. You may remember, and hopefully everyone listened to the first part, that we talked with Professor Joseph Brown, who is joining me again today. And he is an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He is the author of a new article coming out called Stop Cop City, Understanding the Strategic Choices of the Protest Movement, in a journal called Terrorism and Political Violence. But Professor Brown also will have a book coming out on this topic end of this year, early next year. So Professor Brown, welcome back to part 2 of the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, excited to have you. And so we dug into a lot of stuff on Cop City, and then it made sense to do this part 2 because there is so much to talk about that you can't necessarily get in an hour-ish of a podcast. But we want to dig into it for audience. If you're listening, we just have a couple other things we wanted to dig into that we thought were actually important. And the first one is, what is the current status of Cop City? Can you actually just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So unfortunately, the current status of Cop City is that the land that the Police Foundation wanted to clear, they've cleared. The structures that they wanted to build, they've built, and they've actually opened them at this point at the beginning of 2025. So their Cop City is built and business is taking place there. So, that is a shame, obviously, like for people who are associated with the movement. That's obviously a major setback. I remember being back there for a memorial for Tort, like a year after they were killed, and just having to cover my eyes driving by, or just try and not look out the windows driving by, because it was just really sad to see what had been done to the land there.
Actually, I'm here in Berkeley, and so we have this sort of historic occupation that has gone on since the late 60s called People's Park, which in the early 2024, it's on University of California property. The university, along with local police and state police, cleared it, and they put up these giant barricades around it. And what was actually had been like a sort of community space, it was actually a place where a lot of houseless people were camped. It's like that. It's like you drive by it now, and it's actually hard to even look at it with knowing what was there. There's still a lot of the art. There's a lot of street art, murals, and things like that. But it's been taken over by, even in California, in the University of California, we have the authoritarian sort of behavior by these entities.
Yeah, it's a shame, and it's shameful. I think one of the reasons it's especially shameful, not toward the movement, but toward the government, is that they really ignored people who were doing all of the things that you're supposed to do in a supposedly functioning liberal democracy. There is this petition campaign that I alluded to last time, the Vote to Stop Cop City campaign. And the idea of that was, given that the movement was attracting support of these big mainstream liberal/progressive organizations and big religious organizations like the American Friends Service Committee and NAACP Legal Defense Fund, they had all of these people who they trained up to canvass and go collect signatures to put a referendum on the ballot in front of Atlantans to let Atlantans vote on canceling out the project. And even that is imperfect, right? Because Cop City was being built just outside of Atlanta into Cobb County. So it wasn't like people in DeKalb County, like the most affected communities, in terms of the environmental impacts, like the noise issues, the loss of forest. Those folks couldn't vote on it, but at least somebody would be able to vote in a referendum. The requirements for getting that on the ballot, it was something on the order of 70,000 signatures of Atlantans who would vote in previous election. There's all these technicalities about whose signatures count and whose signatures don't, but all of this effort was put into this petition drive, and they came back with 116,000 signatures. Like, it wasn't even close. They surpassed the mark by leaps and bounds, and actually got more They got more petition signatures than the mayor of Atlanta got votes the last time. Like, it was a great success in a lot of ways because of all the organizing that happened, all the popular support. But not everybody who signed that petition would have met the criteria, obviously. You try and screen people as you're collecting petition signatures, but not everybody understands. But it was a petition that should have gotten a referendum on the ballot in a reasonable, functioning, put in big quotes, liberal democracy. And not everybody would have voted to cancel out the funding. Some people were just voting to say Atlantans should be able to vote on this. And the government basically just ignored it. They had their lawyers challenge it in court on a bunch of technicalities. They bogged it down in court. It's still bogged down in court. Like, there's an appeal. And even though Cop City is built, the petition for the referendum is still it's in this sort of legal limbo. And basically what the government did was it created facts on the ground. It tied up the thing in court and then quickly poured as much concrete as possible to render democracy irrelevant. And it actually is an encapsulation of so much of what is wrong with our supposed liberal democracy that we're told we have. There's so many things that powerful people do, whether it's a police lobby or the professional political class running a city. They are really good at finding ways of rendering meaningful democracy irrelevant, so that what you learn in civics class or in my political science class, the rights you're told you have, the democracy you're told you have, is just always a little bit out of reach, or in this case, a lot out of reach. Like, this was a very obvious just thumb in their nose at any semblance of democratic legitimacy. They just pushed it through with raw power and money and lawyering and ultimately lethal violence. So it really hurts I haven't been back there in a long time, but when I do go back, it would be really hard to get me to go anywhere near that site, because it would be a real sad thing to be in a lot of ways. I will say there's a chunk of forest that is still potentially preservable too, right? It's not all the Cop City construction site. There's also that issue of Entrenchment Creek Park. And I think there's a bit more hope of retaining forest because of separate legal processes playing out. So it's not like one of those clear cuts where you see a picture of clear cut logging where everything is just dead. It's a little bit more complex, but Cop City is there and it is open.
Do you think, even though it seems to have, they've built the facility, but do you think that we should feel hopeless after this? Or do you think that we should, there's a lot of things happening in the world where people are rising up and resisting, and some of them are feeling like, we just actually interviewed the directors of the encampments about the Columbia University occupation. Also, part of it was about UCLA. And even though there's been those camps got cleared, lots of bad things happened to students. Since Trump's come in, even worse things have happened to the students. But there was a sense that I had from watching the movie, and also with talking with Michael and Kay, the directors, is that there's still this great sense of hope. And do you think that there's a sense of hopelessness after Cop City, or do you think there's a sense of hope?
This is an issue that I'm getting at in the book a whole lot. Like, the last section of the book is about people processing contradictory feelings of hope and hopelessness. There's this sort of tension between we could win and also feeling, we usually lose, and feeling nihilistic about lacking hope and trying to figure out what we do in a world that's like post-hope. My feelings on that are that, like, all of those reactions are very understandable, and there's very good reasons people are having all of those reactions. People process these things differently. I think in the world of poli-sci, because of the way we do research, probably our data sets code this as a failure, right? And it gets chalked up, depending on how you want to code it, either as a failure of nonviolent protest, or a failure of violent protest, or a failure of mixed protest. But from the outside, right, you can't really tell people whether they succeeded or failed. That's up to them. And often from the outside, you can't even tell what the standard of success or failure is, right? I think this is why you always need to go talk to people about what they're doing and why, and get inside of the thing and say, all right, what are the issues at stake here? And how do people process their own feelings of triumph and their own feelings of tragedy. And I asked people about this a long time ago, right? It was before Cop City was built, right? And people would say things like, every day that we're here is a success, right? Every day that the woods are not cut down, even if they're eventually cut down, it's still a successful day here, right? There are animal species and plant species that have very short lifespans. And there are creatures that lived perfectly happy, healthy, full lives to a full natural conclusion because forest defenders were there and bought them months and years to have a life, right? So in that sense, there's a lot of successes. I think that Cop City is a problem. It's also a metaphor for a broader problem, or like an exemplar of a broader problem, right? The problem of police militarization, the problem of a society that values violence and coercion as its primary tools for dealing with social problems that the society itself created. There are people who are living under the overpasses in Atlanta, right? And as long as the forest encampments existed, I think some of those people were living in the forest instead. So that was a success too. There's a culture that's created at sites of resistance, and building that culture is a success too. Resistance sites, I'm not a biologist. These are going to be very imperfect metaphors. Like inside the cell, there's the organelles, and they're all doing different things, and some of them are just cranking out proteins. And I think a resistance camp is a little bit like those structures, and they crank things out. And some of those things are culture, and some of those things are ideas. I don't even know how to estimate the numbers here, but I think hundreds is a low estimate for the number of people who came through those woods and experienced some part of the culture of resistance there. There would be these weeks of action, and there would be hundreds of people in the woods. There were hundreds of Atlanta teenagers who came through because there were free music shows. There are people who came to the free cafe that people built in the parking lot and experienced, like, oh, a free food distro, right? Now I'm fed for a night. That is a great success. Those things, they don't really show up on the radar of the kind of poli-sci data sets that I'm capable of creating, if that's the kind of research I want to do. But I think that they show up on the radar of humans who experience a place like that, who experience a moment and who experience a movement like that. Any train kid who came through those woods and was housed for a period of time, was fed, and had formative experiences and good experiences with friends and comrades who maybe they're still in touch with, maybe they're not, but like they had a successful experience, like a developmental experience, a spiritual experience of resistance. People take inheritances away from these things and ideas migrate. There is a culture that exists. Like people who were at Standing Rock have Standing Rock with them for the rest of their lives. They were at Line 3, they've got that with them. They were at Stop Cop City, they've got that with them. Sometimes it's the same people because people go from place to place, but like we were talking about the Mountain Valley Pipeline last time, like ideas are generated. People take those inheritances with them, or like remittances with them to other places, and then they build on those ideas. My other research site was the Wet'suwet'en land defense sites, like Unistoten Camp and Gidimt'en Access Checkpoint. People in Atlanta were aware of those and the things being done at those places. And then people at the Wet'suwet'en sites would say, oh, you did this in Atlanta. Tell me about what's happening there. I want to learn from that. And so people are generating culture and knowledge and wisdom for the future. In as much as Cop City is like a metaphor, this is all a much broader issue, right? Like
Right.
with this society that's coming apart at the seams and being held together is not really the right term for it, but like the power structure that we have is using extreme violence to try and hold it together, even though it's obviously not doing useful work for the people who live in it, and it's decompensating ecologically, decompensating in terms of people's basic human needs. Cop City is a site of that sort of like the production and reproduction of violence, and that's a longer struggle fighting against that. And I think people learned a lot. This was inspirational to people. And as a good friend told me, like unpacking what happened together, if you want to look at it more broadly, like there is a cop city type thing in your backyard somewhere, whether it's a literal cop city being built or some other terrible development corporation trying to destroy something beautiful and replace it with pavement. Like everything good is the forest, everything bad is cop city. And we're learning things at each of these sites of struggle, each of these moments of acute struggle. And then we're taking them to the next thing because we're not done. The fight is not beaten and we're not done with it.
Yeah, I have long argued that, it doesn't even have to be these sort of like backcountry forest protest camps either, right? It's like it was Occupy camps in 2011, or it was occupations on universities last year. And I think that these things move. In some ways they're moments more than movements, but I think there's a movement mixed up in there too. We go from Occupy to Ferguson to Standing Rock to Line 3 and Saab Cop City and Columbia University and things. And I think there's that sort of like culture piece. I can trace all of that back to when I first got involved in the early 2000s, to the first camps I was part of back then, right? And so there's an interesting, I really appreciate your point, because I do think there's an interesting sort of reproduction of the culture, which is a culture of resistance, which is also, it's not like a march either. It's not like some of these big these hands-off marches or 50-51 marches we're seeing right now. It's a sort of more of in some ways it's insular, in some ways it's not, but it's much more of a resistance than anything else.
I think that's a really good way of talking about it. And I also think that, so one of the places where I've done the field work for this book is indigenous land, but not specifically indigenous led. The other one was indigenous land and very specifically indigenous led. And the frame of reference is a bit different in those two environments. To talk to Wet'suwet'en elders, the fact of existing at all is success for indigenous people. I think you can also say that about people of color, like various marginalized people of color in the United States. The fact of existing is a successful act of resistance against a system that is trying to kill and suppress you actively every day. And I think that attitude of to exist, to persist, let alone to resist, these are all successes, is an attitude to carry with you in those moments when you feel like, oh my gosh, things are so hopeless. There's a lot of fighting to be done, and a lot of it is just to continue to fight. Like every day that you continue to fight, even in some small way, right? Some mutual aid project you're involved in is resistance. And every day that you do that, you carry the spirit of the forest with you to that. That's a success as well.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other thing that actually, unfortunately, gets reproduced here, which is this repression. And so we see these heavily militarized repression of Occupy and Standing Rock and Cop City. But then the other piece I want to ask you about is that there's where we see the police going heavy in these places, and they're becoming increasingly militarized. It's the state's solution to like all the problems in the world, the widening economic gap, wealth gap, or climate change or anything like that. But there are also a lot more legal tools that they're putting in place, and there's a lot more legal tools that they're using. And so at Cop City, we saw the use of RICO, which is a federal racketeering law, but the states also use it. And then we're also seeing these domestic terror prosecutions. And so I wonder if you could actually talk about that a little bit at Cop City as well.
Yeah. So resistance sites are places where culture of resistance is created and sustained. And we have the memory that we try to build as individuals with very limited time. And as far as I know, there's no like permanent tenured position of radical forests revolutionary, right? But there are permanent positions of law enforcement, prosecutor. The FBI has all of its files going back forever and ever, and those never go away. And unfortunately, they're also building their intellectual legacy from all this too, some of it explicitly and some of it because they just stack precedents on top of precedents. I think that the response to the Atlanta forest occupation is it's an escalation of processes that have been going on for a very long time. Some of them are processes of like slow growth, right? Like police kill more people in America every year, even post 2020 when we had this big national uprising over it and all this.
Seems like they want the other after that, actually.
Yeah, it was despite all of the like liberal hand wringing over all this, like the numbers keep going up. It hasn't gotten any better. It keeps growing. In terms of the legal repression, it has the potential to be like a radical step up in legal repression. This RICO prosecution is horrific, really. There's 61 people indicted under this Georgia law where the attorney general, deputy attorney general, the people who filed the indictment, and essentially have tried to indict a political movement as a criminal enterprise. They're using the mafia law, except the Georgia version of that, you don't have to have made any money on anything to be classified as a criminal enterprise. Like, it's this very elastic law. And so they've classified I want to say movement, but it's actually even just like culture or a set of political associations. They've criminalized mutual aid. The indictment reads like a bad book report on mutual aid, and then it proceeds to list acts of mutual aid as overt acts in furtherance of a criminal conspiracy. Okay, you passed out pamphlets. That's an overt act of a criminal conspiracy. You bought food, you made blog posts. These are all allegations, right? These all have to be proven. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm not part of anything associated with this. I'm not defending anybody in court, and I certainly don't mean to agree with anything in this indictment either. But you go through it, and it's a list of things that are not actually illegal. Renting porta potties for a music festival, like that's an overt act, and now that's a 5 to 20-year felony if this succeeds in court. Some of the overt acts actually precede the movement itself. There are people indicted for things that happened in the summer of 2020, and the state of Georgia has said, oh, you're part of the conspiracy against Cop City. Cop City hadn't been announced yet. It doesn't make any sense. Time doesn't go in that direction. And then even more nefarious, I think, is the fact that the state of Georgia has managed to... Grand jury indictment is a very low bar. Like, grand juries are like a really ridiculous institution that most countries don't have. But they've gotten a grand jury to indict people for normal political behavior and then stuff that's just having principles, like having a book, they're writing a slogan, passing out a pamphlet, and being in a public park, right? Existing while being critical of the government is criminalized in this indictment if prosecutors succeed. And that's horrifying. Because if there's anything that we need right now, it's people being critical of the government.
Being protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah, speaking as radicals here, right? Like, the First Amendment sets a very low bar, right? That we're entitled to a lot more in a just world than what's spelled out there. But yeah, most of the stuff in that indictment is First Amendment protected. Like, blog posts saying things about a protest that occurred. That's just news reporting. That's just having a blog and saying a protest happened. Okay, but that's also listed as an overt act in this giant criminal indictment. Essentially what it does is it criminalizes being critical of the government. It criminalizes organizing and having associations with friends and comrades who might also be critical of the government. It criminalizes mutual aid. Like, the first part of that indictment is just describing this horrifying, nefarious thing called mutual aid. People are giving stuff to other people who didn't pay for it. They have some idea that people ought to organize collectively around principles of non-hierarchical social movements, and they might care about racial justice and Black life. And then it proceeds with, here's all these instances of people doing mutual aid, and we're going to charge them with this massive felony that was originally a law to prosecute the mafia, and like the moral calculus of the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General of Georgia, and the Attorney General is running for governor now, I believe. Like, in their mind, you're part of a movement that criticizes the government. You're on the same moral standing as the mafioso protection racket. Some of the greatest political science research ever done is people just noting all the different ways that the government is actually a protection racket. It's just institutionalized by laws. The state is a protection racket. All you have to do is read basic political science, and it will tend to push you toward being a radical. And it's not even written by anarchists. It's just written by people who look at how power works, right? Yeah, read some Mansur Olson and some Charles Tilley if you want to turn yourself into a raving anarchist. Just read some history.
Talking about the state as a protection racket and talking about it in Atlanta in particular, but also DeKalb County and Fulton County, is the police actually were acting as the sort of partially they were the enforcement, they were the muscle, talking about it in like a mafia metaphor. And could you actually talk a little bit about how we talked quite a bit last time about the state police, because the state of Georgia, the actual state government is actually who was there when Tort was assassinated. But could you actually talk a little bit about the role that the Atlanta police played, and wanted to get out a little bit about how the Atlanta political leadership was responding to this?
Yeah. So this is a little tricky because I don't actually know the full details of how that arrangement worked. Like, I did not go and interview any law enforcement as I was doing my writing. That was not something I felt like I wanted to go and do for various reasons. So I think the big raids were coordinated. They were big raids with like multiple agencies, some of them federal too, staged offsite, and then like hundreds of police and a lot of vehicles and helicopters will all go into the woods. There's obviously some sort of joint terrorism task force dynamic that was happening there. Who was leading what at any given time? That's a really interesting question. And I think that might have been like, this is just purely my speculation, but I don't think anyone really wanted to go near those woods. Like, for law enforcement, it was very clear that they found the woods to be like not particularly pleasant places to go, which is why they would only go in really big numbers, I think. As far as the basic policing on a day-to-day basis, it was some combination of Atlanta police and DeKalb police. But for the giant raids, then there's a lot of state resources involved. And eventually it was the state authorities themselves coordinating the big raid in January of 2023 when they killed Tort. And that was after the governor really getting out in front in public and saying, we're going to go in and squash these outside agitators and out-of-state terrorists. But yeah, there would be press conferences, right, where with Atlanta police saying, here are the things we're going to do to try and clear the forest, like in between the big raids. And the Atlanta police answer to the government of Atlanta. I think maybe what you're getting at here is, to what extent are the Atlanta city authorities responsible for what happened? Is that sort of...
One of the things that really struck me at the time is Brian Kemp, governor of governor of Georgia, he's a right-wing Republican. I don't think he's not necessarily a full-on Trumper, but he's like a right-wing Republican. And so like calling protesters terrorists, justifying that the GBI SWAT team who killed Tort was justified in doing it, all that sort of stuff, I expect that. But is Democratic leadership, it's Black Democratic leadership. And it seems like the political leadership in Atlanta was as much in on this project and policing these protesters as the state of Georgia and Brian Kemp.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up. I think one of the most remarkable...
I think it's an important thing to really name, because a lot of the places where we're seeing some of the harshest repression are blue, like Atlanta. Georgia's probably a purple state. Atlanta's a blue bubble in that. But we're seeing harsh repression in New York and California and Chicago and places like that. I think it's just important to name that a lot of the repression is not just under MAGA Republicans.
Absolutely. I had a lot of conversations with people just even in the years since about how bipartisan it is to ignore democracy and use violence to suppress grassroots political organizing, right? you hear people say these things about we just need more bipartisanship in America. We have plenty of it. It's just on the wrong stuff. Like, it was very bipartisan to squash the referendum. It was very bipartisan to send police into the woods with a whole bunch of guns and pepper balls and dogs, right? That was fully bipartisan. In terms of working with the Atlanta Police Foundation, leasing the land, pushing this through city council, both the lease and the money, that was Democrats. It was largely Black Democrats running a city which up until very recently was majority Black, hand in hand with the very conservative Republican governor, Kemp, who is, he's had his like moments of being friendly and unfriendly with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a capricious individual. You really have to keep buttering him up in order to stay on his good side. And Kemp occasionally doesn't agree with him and then gets on his wrong side. But like, he's a very conservative person who might run for national political office at some point. He could be the next Republican vice presidential nominee, or maybe even run for president himself at some time. Working hand in hand with Andre Dickens and various police allies on city council, and in a very remarkable demonstration of Democrat and Republican multiracial bipartisanship, decided to put all of the resources into violence as opposed to social services and social justice, and to really just flagrantly squash democracy in the process to push this project through.
Yeah. Just because we're getting towards the end of our time, I kind of want to talk about the third topic that I want to talk about, which is around this idea of violence versus nonviolence, which is, it's a long running debate within movement circles. But when we talked, what comes out in your article, and then also when we talked last time, we got a little bit into how we saw evolution around philosophies like this, how we saw hybrids of philosophies like this. And I'm wondering if you could actually just dig in a little bit more about violence versus nonviolence, particularly around the Stop Cop City movement.
Yeah. That's the main thrust of this article, I think. Where do social movements get their ideas about strategy and tactics, and how do they negotiate those boundaries if they do want to have internal conversations about violence and nonviolence? I think what's really remarkable about Stop Cop City is how it didn't really get mired in those discussions. I think that people did a really amazing job. It amazed me, right? Because I came at this with all of the like abstract ideas about violence and nonviolence and the divisiveness of properties destruction, et cetera, not believing in it in a moral sense, but like expecting it as an empirical prediction of the literature, right? When stuff catches fire, then it should be divisive. And it's not like people wouldn't have a lot of different opinions about that kind of thing if it happened. But people adopted this sort of go along to get along attitude. I think part of that's because you have a movement that actually is a convergence of the racial justice uprising with people whose original experience was in like tree sitting and pipeline resistance camps and stuff like that. So you get a convergence of people with different toolkits and different comfort zones, and then they all have to coexist in a pretty small place. It was a square mile of forest, which isn't that big. I mean, it's big for a city, but like it's a relatively small space to be sharing with people. And not everybody agreed about everything. I think there were various opinions outside of the forest too, in terms of the support community about tactics and strategies and what was useful, what was not useful. But when you start combining people in what's essentially a non-hierarchical anarchist or anarchist-informed milieu where nobody is entitled to tell anybody else what you can and can't do or decide what the official tactics are. It was not a Marxist-Leninist space, right? There was no vanguard of people to make those decisions and then impose them on the rest of the people.
No tankies there.
Not that I'm aware of. There might have been like some tanky who came through at some point, but it was basically, what did Donald Trump call them? Anarchist jurisdictions. This would have been an anarchist jurisdiction in the sense that no one could tell anybody what to do. And so you just had to have difficult discussions and go along to get along. So you could get people who were really comfortable with tree sitting, and then people who were very comfortable with physically confronting contractors, and they would have to exist in the same space. And I think through this sort of like accident, like this evolution of we're combining these different strains, what you got was a forest occupation that managed to exist right across the street from the SWAT team staging area, right? There was already a police facility there. There was a firing range in the woods already. So there's plenty of police infrastructure. This forest occupation lasted for more than a year, I think partly because it wasn't just tree sits, right? It wasn't just tree sits and a protest camp. It wasn't just like the kind of cookie cutter approach to a really narrow notion of nonviolence. It had other stuff in it, and the government really had no idea what to do with that.
Yeah.
Like it was very much like this strange off equilibrium beast that no one had seen before, or no one in the US had dealt with before. There's some emails that have come out of, I think it was Atlanta police, maybe it was DeKalb police, essentially like doing a mass email saying, does anybody know how to extract a tree sitter? We've never seen this here before. Like an urban forest occupation, but surrounded by this hostile territory that police were never very excited to try and get into.
Hostile territory being that there were people who were differently minded around tactics and strategies that also made it difficult for them to get even to where the tree sits were.
Yeah, they didn't want to go in the woods.
Yeah.
They're not. So my guess is your average police officer is not super excited to go into a forest. They're probably not that excited to get out of their cruiser. And then there's this sort of like extended woodland riot that's also a nonviolent forest occupation. And also this community movement, right? Because it was embedded in the community. It was broadly supported. And anytime they went and committed some kind of abuse, they were going to get an earful from everybody in the community who was going to show up and protest too, right? Movements persist if they're embedded. And it doesn't matter what kind of movement you are, right? If you're a rebel group, you last a lot longer if you're embedded in the local community.
Right.
And Stop Cop City was very much a community movement. So there's that protective aspect, like you're protected by the fact that people are using the forest to plant a community garden who weren't using it to plant a community garden before, right? There are public events there. There's the Week of Action. There are people who are teaching indigenous foraging skills and plant medicine in the woods. The Muskogee came all the way from Oklahoma, did a ceremony in the woods. There's this sort of social defenses that a movement has. It's embedded in society. And then there was the fact that like the forest infrastructure was physically just in the middle of this area that your average police officer in blue is not very comfortable operating in.
We're very welcome.
Not welcome, and therefore not especially comfortable. And I think that combination of things, like the broader social movement, the tactic of the tree sit and the nonviolent forest occupation, and then that sort of gray zone of they're people in camouflage and they're unpleasant to deal with before we even get to the tree sit. I think had those people not been there, this would not have lasted as long as it did. It lasted a very long time, right across the street from all of the police infrastructure that was already there. This in itself is a victory, right? Like exceeding expectations dramatically and having an urban forest occupation for more than a year when, I don't know, reasonable expectations would have been this shouldn't last long at all, but it did.
At Cop City, we saw sabotage, we saw targeting of property, both in the forest, in the near vicinity of the forest, but we also saw that around the country connected to Cop City. And so the surrounding community, or even people who were sympathetic to the campaign in greater Atlanta, were there drawbacks did people disagree with that? Did people step out because of that? Or is it this, or did we inhabit this, or was this space being inhabited where people were comfortable enough with it to because they realized that everyone was headed towards a similar end goal, the same
So
end goal.
yes and no, right? Like anytime you have a really contentious movement, protests are messy, right? They're gonna inconvenience a lot of people. Like if the transit workers go on strike, the average commuter is inconvenienced by that. Protests are always going to inconvenience somebody by their very nature. And of course, there's going to be a diversity of opinions about different tactics and strategies, right? Someone's going to say, oh, they need to do this the right way first. Why are they occupying the woods and making a mess in the forest? Even before you talk about sabotage.
Which,
Yes, a spectrum of opinion, and you're not going to keep everybody, right? And the more you push the boundaries, potentially, the harder it is to hold people together. But it can be done, and I think that's what this movement shows, right? It managed to sustain a really broad and also just like deep on an emotional level in terms of what people, how much of themselves people poured into this. The coalition stayed strong by and large. I'll give the example of what happened. So after Tort was killed by the police, there was the reoccupation of the forest in March of 2023. There was the music festival, and then there was also, you can see the video online. I'm not breaking any news here, but there was a sabotage action at the Cop City construction site. Like that's very much a matter of public record. There were discussions afterwards with activists, like community people who had helped to plan the week of action. And publicly, there wasn't a bunch of recriminations about, oh, the protesters didn't stay peaceful, but there were some tense discussions behind closed doors about it. What people were saying, though, wasn't necessarily, oh, this is beyond the pale that you did this thing. It was more like, I'm getting this secondhand, right, from people I interviewed, but the anecdote that shows up in the book is someone saying, did you have to do it on the first day? Could you have waited till the music festival had already happened? And that's actually pretty remarkable, right? The fact that people were willing to say this is a sufficiently important struggle, and the government has not been listening to all the liberal democratic stuff and the sign waving and the peaceful civil resistance stuff. I'm willing to say that somebody maybe decided to sabotage this stuff, and that's how they engaged. And maybe that's okay, but did it have to happen on the first day of the week of action or the second day of the week of action? If that's the conversation you're having, that's like a pretty solid sign that people are willing to make common cause with activists using many different tactics. They might have had a disagreement about when and where, but the sabotage wasn't in itself a deal breaker for a lot of people.
We're getting near time. So one last question. And we have seen campaigns and direct action happen for a long time. We've definitely been seeing an uptick of it in the last decade or two, for sure. And I'm wondering, there's how activists look and think about violence and nonviolence. Do you think that scholars are looking at it in a similar way? So scholars who are reporting on it or writing on it for history or what have you. Same with politicians and journalists. It seems like the media gets this notion of violence and nonviolence pretty often. I often think media, at least corporate media, is just like a propaganda machine for the ruling class anyway. But do you think that these things are being looked at and thought about differently by whoever the particular group doing the thinking is?
So I think that different people get their ideas from different places. I think that scholars get ideas from other scholars. That's the iterative process of scholarship, or like the accumulation of research over time. And that means that scholarship can change. This article is in some ways a critique of scholarship, but it's in the spirit of saying, hey, there's some stuff we need to account for that maybe we haven't accounted for enough yet. It's not like this whole enterprise of nonviolent scholarship is bad and we need to get rid of it. I think it's more a call to say we need to engage with people who are actually doing activism and see what those concepts mean to them before we can understand what the political implications are going to be of different tactics. And there's actually a lot of gray area that we haven't unpacked. And the gray areas are areas where you see a lot of differences of opinion. I think your average person on the street, if you approach them and say, oh, someone broke a window, terrorism has occurred, they'll look at you and go, really? or, oh, someone has put sugar in the tank of in the gas tank of a vehicle, violence has occurred. They're probably going to look at you askance and say, really? Is that sugar in the... You've disabled a piece of property, but the police have killed 1,300 people this year. Which of these things is more salient to your average person? Police violence. So I think that there is a bit of a disjuncture.
Except for the property owner, I'm sure they look at it different.
I'm sure
Yeah.
and to some extent, the notion of nonviolence in scholarship is very property friendly. It's also not the core of the scholarship. I think the scholarship mostly is saying if you hurt people or if you don't hurt people, but they are still classifying the sabotage stuff as violence. But there's room to introduce extra nuance there. And I think that there's a lot of gray area in the way we talk about these things. And we do learn over time, right? Maybe this is a case that teaches some useful things to future iterations of scholarship. It certainly has, I've learned a lot, right? I was expecting certain things to be a lot more divisive than they actually were. Like I was like biting my nails a bunch of times saying, oh boy, what's going to happen now? This looks really scary. What happened? Is the coalition going to fracture? And you ended up being a lot more resilient than that. And I put in a plug here at the end though, speaking of coalitions, there's 61 people fighting these racketeering charges who are doing a really remarkable job of mounting a unified group defense, despite the government's best efforts to separate them, to get them to point fingers at each other, to divide and conquer. And I think the reason this racketeering prosecution is still held up in court and is still dragging on, it is awful to have your life placed on hold by something like this if you're one of those indicted people. But they are really doing an amazing job of maintaining a unified front. And that's an example to all of us involved in social movements, whether it's resisting the sort of prisoner's dilemma thing that the prosecutors try and do to get you to like point fingers at other people, or resisting a grand jury and the way they try and use those to crack open social movements. People are doing a huge amount of work at super high risk to themselves and a great cost personally, emotionally, also financially. Some of them are people who are associated with the bail fund, like the people who fund lawyers for protesters are indicted for racketeering here. And I think this is a key moment to remark on what's happening, but also support people who are resisting on all of our behalfs, these authoritarian impositions by state authorities. There's some things you can do to support those folks in their defense. Is it okay if I plug them?
Yep.
Atlanta Solidarity Fund, the people who did the bail fund work and trying to find lawyers for protesters, who 3 of them were then themselves indicted for racketeering. Atlanta Solidarity Fund is still collecting money for the work that it does, atlsolidarity.org. There's also individual fundraisers for defendants, like specific people who are fighting the RICO charges. You can go to Linktree, linktr.ee/Weelani Arrestee fundraisers. Lawyers are not cheap, and the government has more money than anyone else will ever have in this game. But there are some lawyers representing folks, and they've got to pay their bills. They got to pay bills to get to court. So I think this is something that anybody can do, whether you're able to show up at a demo outside of the courthouse when the court proceedings are happening. That's super helpful. But even if you can't, there's guides for supporting people who are resisting, who need help. And actually their case is everybody's case in a sense. What happens to them is a precedent. So they need our support for that reason too.
We'll put the links in the show notes too. But it's important to point that out is that the state of Georgia, or whoever in this case, is going after not just the activists who have allegedly done the actions or allegedly done whatever the act is, but they're going after the pillars of support. And so they're going after people who provided porta potties and food. They're going after the legal fund. And so it's just an important thing to note is that the state is actually trying to, and I'm sure they want to set a precedent here so this can happen in other parts of the country as well. Just it's a model that the law enforcement wants to go to because, as we know, in response to what I was saying before, wealth disparity, climate crisis, all of that, is their only solution is to militarize the police and militarize law.
And I know we got to go, but like one of the major red flags for sliding into authoritarianism and dictatorship is when the government criminalizes the lawyers. Like when they make it a crime to represent someone accused of a crime, or they make it a crime to find a lawyer for someone who's accused of a crime, you are in deep trouble. So like this case has huge implications, whether you're a radical or a liberal or just don't want to live in, name your style of dictatorship you don't want to live in. But criminalizing the people who find a lawyer for the people who are at the protest is a really big and scary step that we got to push back against.
And we're now seeing that on a federal level. They're going after judges. We're seeing immigration lawyers be detained when they're coming back into the country. All kinds of disturbing things happening. That's just also an indicator here.
You saw it in the Peachtree State before you saw it from the Orange Man at the national level.
Exactly. And Bondi, we're gonna end it there. We went a little bit over time, but this was awesome. Professor Brown, I want to thank you for joining us for part 2, and hopefully we can have you back for part 3 when your book comes out. Folks, we've been talking with Professor Joseph Brown, who's a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, author of a new article called Stop Cop City, Understanding the Strategic Choices of Protest Movements. This will also be out in book version end of the year next year.
That's spring or summer next year, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to let it go there. But folks, if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening to this on the audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenandredpodcast. And until then, everybody else, no matter what's happening, go out there and make trouble and misbehave. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Scott.